Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. You know, some people love to tell stories, and a lot of older people love to tell about their earlier years. Fred Pillsbury was very active in the U.S. Air Force, the Strategic Air Command, during the Cold War. He now loves to tell the story of that part of our history and also the story of aircraft as he leads young people around the Castle Air Museum in Central California. He tells me, though, he's not from the West. He grew up in the East.
Well, I'm from the East Coast. I'm actually from Massachusetts originally. I grew up, and for some reason or other, I always loved airplanes, and I always kind of wanted to fly. And went through regular schooling, did not go to college. I graduated from high school, and I worked for about a year. And back in that time frame, I graduated high school in '54, worked for a year or so in '55. But back in that time frame, we were looking at the draft, and I didn't want to be drafted and go into the infantry, and I wanted to fly. So I took the test with the idea that I would get into the Air Force and be a flyer. And in the background, I was going to say, okay, if I couldn't fly, I'd join the Air Force in whatever capacity they would have me. But I passed all the tests. I wanted to be a pilot, but I didn't pass the complete test, so they put me in as a navigator, and I went to navigator training.
So here you are, a young man starting out, and you're learning on what was the biggest state-of-the-art plane at the time. And the B-52 is still a big plane.
I remember when I graduated from the upgrade navigation training, got assigned to B-52s, and I remember someone said, well, congratulations, Fred, you're going to the biggest and the best. And I always remember that statement, because back then it was the biggest and the best, and still one of the biggest and one of the best, still.
So you start out learning navigation. And where did you take your training? At what base?
Started at Lackland Air Force Base as basic officer and navigation training. Then went to Harlingen Air Force Base in Texas.
You can't get much farther south in Texas than Harlingen.
And then went to advanced bombing navigation training at Mather Air Force Base in Sacramento. And then came to Castle for B-52 training. And then my first operational base was Westover Air Force Base in Springfield, Massachusetts.
So you end up back home. Back home in Massachusetts. You know, I didn't know that there was such a big base in Springfield. I know Springfield is not Boston. It is out west in Massachusetts.
It was a big base.
I didn't know you had any level ground out there to put an airport.
We had three B-52 squadrons and 3 tanker squadrons. It was a big base.
Wow. Yeah. I guess it was. Well, as I mentioned at the start, we're here at Castle Air Museum, which is adjacent to Castle Air Force Base. I lived here in the area for a while, but it was after the base had closed. How did Castle Air Force Base, which has, if you look at it from the air, more tarmac and runway than you can imagine? You could land. I think they could have landed the shuttle here if they had to.
It was one of the alternate landing fields planned if an emergency occurred and they had to go. How
did Castle fit into the scheme of things in the heyday of the B-52?
Primarily, its purpose was for training new crews, training the tanker crews and the bomber crews. Then they would leave here and go to their various operational bases for a final checkout, and they'd become combat ready and do their thing. But Castle always had a war mission in the event of an emergency condition where Russia attacked or whatever, Cuban Missile Crisis or anything like that. We always had a war mission. The crews that were stationed here, instructor crews, also had to train and study for a wartime mission. We pulled various alerts just like the other SAC bases did. So we kind of had a dual mission, but our primary mission, I guess you could say our primary mission was still a wartime mission, but in reality, our biggest dedication was to train the crews.
Did most of the B-52 crews who flew during the 50s come through here?
They all did initially. All the original
so it was
crew training was
the training base for the B-52.
It was.
Tell us a little bit about that plane. I mean, when you get up underneath it, It is so impressive. I'm trying to remember the model number of the plane that's a hybrid that has both jets and propellers.
That's the B-36.
That's a big plane.
That's the biggest bomber ever built is the B-36.
Do you have one here?
We have one here, and it's got 10 engines. It has 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines.
Because I remember the first one I ever saw, I think, was at the Dayton Air Museum. Yeah. It was inside a building, and it dominated. You walked under it no matter where you were.
It's a huge airplane.
For those who've never seen a B-52, tell us about the scope of this plane and what it could do.
Well, it's basically it's 185 feet long. The wingspan from tip to tip is approximately 180 feet long. When it's fully loaded with fuel or bombs and fuel, whatever the condition may be, the model that we have on display here and also the model that I flew most of my time in weighed 450,000 pounds on takeoff. B-52 that's flying today is an H model, which is the, quote, new B-52. The last one was built in 1962. And that airplane is a little bit different in design, but it's still a B-52. That airplane weighs 488,000 pounds when it's fully loaded at takeoff, just because of the slightly different design. But the older B-52, such as the one that I flew most of my time in and the one that we have stationed here on display, weighed 450,000 on takeoff. Has 8 engines. They have huge tip tanks on the end of the wings for extra fuel. Each tip tank carries 3,000 gallons of fuel, which weighs basically 18,000 pounds each. And if you see a B-52 on the ground when it's full of fuel, you'll see the wings are bending down, and they have tip gear on the end of the wings, and that's because if they didn't, the wings would actually drag on the ground.
Wow.
And again, the design of the B-52, the wingtip can actually flex 18 feet up and 18 feet down. That's the design of the airplane.
Better hope the rivets hold.
Yeah, you should.
So in a way, in turbulence, did it look like a bird flying? I mean, were the wings flapping?
Not that much, but I was a navigator on a bombardier, and we sat downstairs in the B-52, and you didn't have windows to look out. We saw out of the airplane with a radar set.
You were down in the office.
But you could walk upstairs, climb upstairs, and look out of the side window. And if you looked at the wing, it'd be kind of eerie, but it didn't really wiggle straight up and straight down, but it would ripple. You could look out and you look at the wing, and it would just kind of ripple as you look at it. But again, it's just the design.
Flexible metal.
Flexible.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's interesting when you talk about the design. The B-52 was designed by 5 or 6 engineers in a motel room with a slide rule. That's back in the older days.
Pre-calculator.
And it's still flying today.
And who made it?
Boeing.
It was a Boeing plane. I have a great respect for Boeing. I know Lockheed made some incredible planes, and up at the Skunk Works, and you have one of the Blackbirds.
SR-71.
Out front here, which was so far ahead of its time when it flew.
Look at the KC-135. That's built by Boeing. Same thing.
In the heyday of training, they tell me that just to the south of here, 4 miles, is a city called Merced, that the planes came almost down Main Street in landing, and every 20 minutes you had to stop talking because military planes don't have noise abatement on them.
No, and the old B-52 and the 135, when they were flying low and coming in, they'd make a lot of noise. Same with takeoff. They'd make a lot of noise. B-52, in my days, it was a 6-person crew. I say 6-man crew because it used to be back then, but now they have females flying as crew members as well. So it's a 6-person crew. The 6-person was 2 pilots, a pilot, a co-pilot. Downstairs there would be a navigator and a radar navigator or bombardier. Then also upstairs there'd be an ECM, electronic countermeasures, or electronic warfare officer. And then in the tail would be a gunner. So that would be your 6-person crew. The B-52H model that's flying today, because of the advancement of wartime and the fact that instead of fighters coming after you, usually they fire missiles, they did away with the gunner position. So the B-52 that flies today is a 5-person crew. And they're also, when they fly for training, you'll have instructors on board. So you can fly with as many as 9 people, or with the B-52, the older B-52s, you could fly with as many as 10 people.
Was it cramped when you did that? I bet, yeah. Because
not a lot of room.
I'm thinking that unlike passenger planes, this new Boeing 787 Dreamliner, for example, it's not creature comfort. They want to get bombs on that thing. Yeah. They want to get equipment. You know, one of the things that the average person doesn't know, and I didn't know until I was on a demonstration flight of a flying Fortress.
Well, the B-17.
We drove up to Livermore, which I will tell everyone is a little over an hour from here, and then flew back at a wonderfully low altitude. As a matter of fact, I got a great view of the canals and the almond groves and everything else. The fact that the outer skin is the inner skin. There's no padding that you could bang, 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 and that's the outside of the airplane, and noisy.
Yeah.
And you sat on the floor. It was quite a trip. I think if it had lasted any longer, I would have started getting sick.
I've flown in both the B-17 and the B-24 with the Collins Foundation, and you think about that, the thin metal skin, and then you think about these guys in World War II. That's it. There's no protection.
No. And doesn't take much shrapnel to go through, or flak, I should say, at that altitude. Was the 52 pressurized?
Yes.
It was. So you didn't have to wear oxygen mask except in an emergency.
Yeah. So that was a big thing.
Were they heated?
Yeah, you had air conditioning.
Because you talk about World War II. Those 19, 20-year-old kids were up there freezing to death, gasping for air. What an assignment.
Yeah. When I do tours out here, I'm a tour guide for the museum, and that's one of the things I try to impress on some of these younger people, that what this country did and what these young people went through flying these missions in World War II, what they went through, not just being shot at and trying to protect themselves and the airplanes from fighters, but the extreme cold and the fact that they were heated flying suits and breathing oxygen and getting shot at and everything else. They really went through some tough times.
I think young people today, of course, I always say they don't know anything. And you being slightly older than I, not much, may think I don't know anything. But the concept of the draft is so completely foreign to kids today.
That's right.
And, of course, during World War II, there were far fewer questions about whether a person should go to war unless they were a conscientious objector. But if your number was called, kiss your girlfriend goodbye, because that was it. And a lot of those boys, far too many of them, of course, didn't come back.
That's right.
The ones flying out of Britain, I think they would fly X number of missions and then they could go home after that. But a lot of them never made it to that number.
From what I know, that basically they had to fly 25 combat missions before they could come home. And I've talked to a lot of people that said that the average number of missions a crew would fly before they bought the farm would be 13.
Wow.
That would be the
lucky
average.
13.
Yeah.
Fred Pillsbury, during the height of the Cold War, and that's another thing we need to talk about. I mean, I graduated from high school in 65, so I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember what I was wearing when we heard John Kennedy had been killed. But during that time, we didn't know if the Russians were going to fly over Canada and be down our throats.
That's right.
What was the feeling at an Air Force base like, as far as knowing you had to be prepared back then?
Well, it's kind of strange, especially when you first started. I remember my first alert tour after I got combat ready. We did our studying on a war plan, and we used to pull 7 days of alert where you were ready to go to war. Your airplane was ready to go. You had all your combat mission folders stored on the airplane and locked up. And if the whistle blew, you ran out the airplane, and you didn't know till you got the radio message whether it was practice or whether it was for real. And I remember the first 1 or 2 alert tours I had, it really kind of an eerie feeling because you didn't know. Then as time went on and you did more and more of it, you kind of got used to it. But in the back of your mind, you still wondered every time that whistle blew.
Did they keep the engines hot? I mean, how long did it take to fire one of these up?
Not that long. The longest time would be getting from the alert pad to the airplane. Now, the airplanes usually were parked pretty close. Sometimes you could run directly to the airplane depending on how close the airplane was to the alert pad. Other times you had a vehicle and you'd drive to the airplane. But usually from the instant the whistle blew, within 5 minutes or so, you'd have the engines running, locked up and ready to start taxiing if you had to taxi.
Wow.
Within 10 minutes or so, you could be airborne if you had to launch. It didn't take that long. You could always have a maintenance problem where an engine wouldn't start or something, but that was not typical. You know, before you put an airplane on alert, you pre-flighted really good and you had started engines, made sure everything was right before it went on alert. And once it goes on alert, hopefully it would work. But
when Castle was at its height here, how many B-52s would have been parked behind us?
I think we had 33 B-52s assigned here. We were putting through a lot of crews back in its heyday. And then we also had a matching number of KC-135s. I mean, this base was huge.
And those are tankers?
Tankers, yeah. The KC-135 with the tankers. So we had a massive number of them here. But we were putting crews through here like you couldn't believe.
Can you tell us the delicacy and aerial ballet, if you will, involved in mid-air tanking, refueling? I just can't imagine that.
I know.
You fly the hose in a way, don't you?
Yeah, and, you know, I was a navigator and a bombardier, so I can't relate to it like a pilot could. But it took training for the pilots to get used to it, and, of course, it took training for the tanker people to fly a stable airplane. But once the pilots got used to it, the good pilots could do it. It was almost like second nature to them. But basically, the B-52, the refueling receptacle on the B-52 was actually up on top of the aircraft behind the pilot. So they could not see, when they hooked that boom into the airplane, the pilots could not see it going in. They had to fly position on the tanker, basically. The tanker has a boom operator that lays on his stomach back there, and he has a window to look out, and he's got controls. And he can make the boom go up and down, left and right, and in and out. So he kind of talks the pilot into position, and he can position the boom until he finally gets it in the right position, and he plugs it into the refueling receptacle. And then once he does, it kind of locks in position. Then the B-52 pilot just basically has to stay in the proper position. If he gets too far out of position, there's going to be a disconnect.
Now, what happens, for example, they hit turbulence, clear air turbulence or something? Does the hose shut off so you're not spilling jet fuel out in the atmosphere?
As long as you stay connected, it's fine. If you get a disconnect, whether it's turbulence or the pilot just gets out of position, it'll stop. The fuel will stop. And wait until you come back in and disconnect. I can remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we used to refuel over Spain, and I don't know why, but it would be quite turbulent flying over Spain and refueling up around, I don't remember the altitude, but you'd be up around 25,000 feet roughly refueling.
You could still be in some high tops up there.
Yeah. And it was always very choppy. And again, I was fortunate, I had good pilots, and they could refuel without a disconnect, no problem whatsoever. Some pilots would have problems and several disconnects, but once they got used to it, it was okay. The interesting thing is the maximum distance of that refueling boom from the tanker to the bomber was 33 feet. And, you know, you're refueling about 400 miles an hour and so on and so forth. But it's kind of relative. It's, you know, it's like two cars close down the highway. And so on.
Yeah, I'm sure it took a lot of practice to get good at it.
And I always remember my pilot saying, once you get in position, you just fly position on the tanker. If the tanker turns, you turn. If it goes up, you go up. You know, and there's probably a lot to that. I can't relate to it as a pilot, but.
What was your scariest moment flying in a B-52? Was there one or a handful, or would it take all day to talk about them?
No.
I don't mean to cast a bad thing here, but, you know, flying is dangerous.
Yeah. I think the scariest one I had was we took off once on a airborne alert mission where we were grossed out, max weight. We had nuclear weapons on board and everything, and we took off. And soon after takeoff, the pilot calls to bring the flaps up and whatnot, and he did. And about 10 seconds after the gunner hollered, "Stop the flaps, stop the flaps." And the gunner has a clear view of most of the airplane where the pilots can't see everything. And anyway, what happened is, as the flaps were coming up, one of the flaps, there's actually two sections on each side of the airplane, of the flap. One of the sections of the flaps had ripped off the track, bent 90 degrees, and was cutting into the wing. And I always thank God that we had a gunner back there looking, because otherwise you don't know what would have happened. So anyway, they stopped the flap. We had to abort the mission, were too heavy to land, so they had to just fly the airplane, get the feel for the airplane, burn off fuel and all this and that. But that was kind of a scary situation for a while. Everybody kind of tightened up their straps and seat belts and all that kind of stuff. It all worked out fine. Pilot made a good landing, so on and so forth, and it worked out fine. But for a while, it was a little scary.
You know,
there were probably a few other times, but it's, it's like any hazardous job, I guess. It's your job. You get used to it, and you do what you have to do.
Well, I remember coming into work one day at the network, and the person ahead of me doing the hourly newscast had said another near miss in aviation. This was back a couple of years after '86, which was the worst year in the history, I think, of aviation. A plane couldn't get the gear down. It was a 727 going into St. Louis. So they foamed the runway at the nearby Air Force Base over in Illinois there. I can't pull the name up. And they did a perfect landing. Well, I came on the air, and I said, not that there was a near miss, I said there was a perfect emergency landing, and the pilot deserved a pat on the back, because to me, don't scare people to death.
Yeah.
Pilots rehearse for that. Yeah. Because it's just like the astronauts. They have a book of contingencies as thick as the Sears Roebuck catalog they used to on the shuttle on things that could go wrong. Yep. Fred, there is an emblem out front that just is so wonderfully American and such a strong phrase, and that's Strategic Air Command. Yeah.
Close to my heart.
Yeah, tell us about that.
That's one of the commands in the Air Force, Strategic Air Command. Primarily, they were responsible for bombers and the tankers, primarily to provide the nuclear deterrence to keep Russia from attacking our country. Once I got through training and became operational, I was in Strategic Air Command for my whole career. Very proud of it. It was a good command. We had a job to do, and people don't realize it, but the Cold War was after World War II, so the Cold War was in existence from 1946 to 1991, when they officially declared the Cold War over. And it's a war that we won because Russia never did attack us.
And
a lot of people don't realize that.
And we have to realize, looking at history, is the Russians had flexed their muscles blockading Berlin. Yeah. At the beginning of the Cold War, and there again it was the airlift. It was some of those old DC-3s, and I think they were coming into Tempelhof Airport there every 40 seconds or something.
I've heard if you had a misapproach, because there was bad weather and everything. We think about some of the stuff that went on. There was bad weather. If you had a missed approach, that was too busy to go around. You went back to wherever you came from, because there wasn't time to go around and come back in to fit in with other airplanes landing.
There are those great pictures of kids out catching chocolate bars that the pilots were throwing out the windows and everything. It was a wonderful thing.
They called it the candy bombers.
The candy bomber, yeah.
That's
What was the safety record like here at Castle? There was never a horrible on-field accident, was there?
Well, we did have some accidents here. I don't remember the numbers.
Well, if you consider if they were taking off and landing every 20 minutes, I mean, the margin of error goes up.
Considering the amount of activity we had here, and considering a large amount of the flying was done by students, because there were instructors involved, but it was basically student training, the percentage would have to be very low. We did have some accidents here, and there were some people killed here.
Even though you were not a pilot, you knew the pilots.
Yeah.
Do you have any remembrances of reactions when this young guy first gets behind the yoke of a B-52 and takes off with that thing? And the 52, if you know flying, they say rotate. If you go to an airport, you'll see, for example, a 757 will suddenly nose up. The 52 couldn't know. It just kind of rises off the runway.
The 52 just kind of takes off flat. Just kind of rises flat, as opposed to the tanker now is different. The 135 rotates and climbs up.
But the reaction of these young guys, I just can't imagine what it would be like to pull back on the yoke and lift a B-52 off the ground.
Yeah. Typically, the instructor's going to be in the right seat or the co-pilot seat, and the student will be in the pilot or the left seat. So the instructor's going to be there, and he's going to have control of the aircraft. So he's going to be able to take over instantly if there's something going wrong. So it's not so much a safety problem as long as the instructor's doing his thing and aware of things, which, you know, they're going to have top-notch people here and whatnot. But it's got to be something that he's got to watch out for. My instructor duties, I was never a flight line instructor here at CAS. I flew as instructor here with something called replacement training unit. We trained crews that were already combat ready, but we were training them in the D model B-52 to go over to Vietnam. So when I flew as an instructor, I was flying with combat ready crew members, but we were training in a different type of an aircraft, different model aircraft. So our instructor duties were kind of different than flying with a brand new student. So that's kind of different. Although I've flown where I've heard an instructor holler a couple of times because someone wasn't doing what they were supposed to do and so on and so forth. But overall, you'd have to say the instructors do a good job.
I remember seeing a documentary one time about the 747. There was a female pilot who said she weighed 102 pounds. And she said you cannot understand what it's like for a person weighing 102 pounds to pull back and lift a 747 off the ground.
Yeah, that would be something.
Like many bases around the world, Congress decided to shut it down. I asked Fred whether the news that Castle would be closing came as a surprise.
I think it was pretty much a surprise because the real primary job at Castle was training B-52 and 135 crews. And when the base closed, there's still, and even today, they're still training 135 and B-52 crews. And you couldn't beat Castle for training. You could fly almost every day. You could fly here at Castle. There'd be maybe 1 or 2 days you might not be able to fly because of really bad fog. And as a result, they ended up, the B-52 training ended up at Barksdale Air Force Base, which had B-52s, but they had to beef up the base. They had to spend extra money to beef up the base and whatnot to provide training there. And the tanker training went to Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma. And from what I know, they had to spend a lot of money to upgrade housing and stuff like that to facilitate the extra training there. And to most of us here, it didn't make a lot of sense to close this base, upgrade facilities at those other 2 bases to continue the training that we were doing here.
What's called number juggling. See, the Pentagon can say, we have cut Castle Air Force Base, we've cut this. They don't say, but of course now we're going to have to spend a truckload of money somewhere else.
So I think there were a lot of people that felt like I just relayed. There's probably a lot of politics involved and everything, who knows, but that was kind of the general feeling from a lot of people. And I think a lot of it was a surprise.
One of the other things that happens when a base closes is that you pull an enormous amount of educated people out of a community. I remember a lady here saying that there were so many Air Force wives who were here in all the clubs. And when Castle closed, the Elks Club, the Kiwanis, whatever, the women, the DAR, all these organizations, scouting, lost. There was this big brain drain that happened here.
There's definite loss. There's no doubt about it.
Now you stayed though. Have you stayed all the time?
Yeah. I was already retired when the base closed. I had no real reason to move. It was a loss to the community. There's no doubt about it, and they still talk about that. They've done a lot of improvements out here to the old base. We do have businesses out here. They're still trying to attract more businesses.
But this is not the best time in the economy to attract a business anywhere.
And it hasn't thrived like people have hoped it has. They keep working on it, and someday it may thrive more than it has now. Some of the bases that have closed, I can think of Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire. That place is just a thriving business place. I don't know what it is, but who knows?
How do you keep the runways in shape when you're not using them? I mean, if you get enough weeds growing out there, it'll tear up the cement.
They have spent a lot of money on this runway out here. It's the fourth or fifth largest runway in California, and they have spent a lot of money on it. It's all FAA approved. They've narrowed it. As I understand it, it can handle any airplane that's flying. I hate to say it, except B-52, because of the wingtips.
Yeah.
They've narrowed the runway, and the lights on the edge of the runway are raised up. And technically, except in emergency, a B-52, the wingtip could hit the lights.
Isn't that sad?
Yeah.
It's just, you almost
Now, that's
tear up
my
saying
understanding
that.
from what I hear.
No, I had heard that too.
But if it was an emergency, it could still land.
I have a friend who flies his own Beechcraft. It's a fairly decent single-engine plane. It seats 6.
Yeah.
And he flew up here one time, and there was a lot of turbulence near the ground, and he was talking to the tower, and the tower said, well, take your time. He said, we've got over 2 miles here. And Jimmy said to me, he said, that was the longest runway he had ever, he said, I felt really good. As far as I could see, I had cement left.
Yeah. You know, they do have that flying school out here. The Chinese students are learning to fly, and then China sends them here, and I guess China pays for them. They learn to fly, then they go back to China, and then China's training them there to fly their airlines and whatnot. So it is pretty active out here with the smaller airplanes and learn to fly. But
well, we should tell people, you were talking about how you can fly nearly year-round. We are right in the center of California's San Joaquin Valley, which looks as if the Jolly Green Giant ironed it. So from a pilot standpoint, on a clear day, you can probably see the runway 20 miles away. And it's a very forgiving, I think that's the thing about it. You've got a lot of space to make mistakes in. And that must have been really valuable to those student pilots.
Yeah. It's quite a place, really.
Now, we can hear a train in the background. We're right near the railroad track. I wonder if that's how they brought in the jet fuel, whether it was tanker.
They did bring a lot of it in that way, because they've got side tracks, and they bring them out there.
I don't know. You probably don't have the figure, but I often wondered, every B-52 flight, how much that costs. Because it's your tax dollars at work, but you're burning up fuel like crazy.
Yeah.
It's a chunk of change. It was a chunk of change during the training every 20 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
To get. What was it like here? Paint a picture, if you will, when you had those 30 planes parked out there, and you had crews milling around, and pilots in uniform, and people fueling the planes. It must have been like a beehive.
It was busy. Like you say, busy. You got crews. Base ops is busy. You got crews briefing, weather briefings, all that kind of stuff. Then you got crews and buses going out to airplanes running pre-flights. And then you got crews and engines running to go out to the taxiway out to get ready to take off. You got maintenance crews working on airplanes round the clock, basically. Very, very busy. And both the tankers and the bombers just round the clock. Because of noise abatement and whatnot, they were pretty restricted at night takeoffs and landings and whatnot. They used to, takeoffs would be restricted quite a bit at nighttime, and they'd try to bring the landings in so it didn't interfere too much at nighttime and whatnot. But it was a busy place, no doubt about it.
Now, when there were training missions out of here, how far out would they go before? Was there a standard route they flew, or would
there's a going back along? There was standard departure that you had to fly, and I can't remember exactly depending on which way you took off, but there would be a standard departure, and I can't remember now, but
well, it's been a few years.
Yeah, it's been a while.
The Cold War wasn't exactly yesterday.
And I was just looking, the end of this month, I'll be retired 27 years. It doesn't seem possible.
No, congratulations. Yeah.
But there'd be a standard departure route. It'd bring you either north or south, depending which way you took off, and you'd fly out about, probably 1 to 2 minutes. Then you'd turn left or right, depending which way you'd taken off. And there'd be a set pattern to fly and climb. And it'd usually be a set pattern to about 18,000 feet. And that would be a standard departure. Then you'd pretty well be on your own depending on the clearance you had from FAA. Mm-hmm. and depending on your flight plan, et cetera.
Yeah, I never stopped to think, and it's so elemental. that the FAA and the flight controllers for Delta, everybody else, have to know where you are because you're up there also. Yeah.
And we had regular clearances, and you had to talk to FAA and get clearance and everything else, just like everyone else.
Now, since all the planes looked alike, unlike World War II where they had nose paint, how did you just go by tail number? I mean, when you went out to your plane, did you always park your plane you're assigned to in the same parking space? How did you find your plane?
No, the planes would be parked wherever maintenance had room, where they were working, so on and so forth. But they would know when you had your mission briefing, so on, they'd tell you where your airplane would be parked. And you'd drive to that parking spot, and so you'd also look at the tail number and see.
You weren't always assigned to the same plane.
No, you'd fly. You never flew.
So you couldn't hang up your photos and everything.
No,
it wasn't your plane, so to speak.
Not like World War II with.
Well, I guess during World War II, because, as we said before, it was those young kids risking their life every minute, you had to give them a little sense of ownership.
I guess so.
Of that plane.
They did basically have their own airplane to fly most of the time, unless it wasn't working right or something.
Well, you hear those great stories, too, about how the flight crew became so dependent on all the members. There was that incredible camaraderie between, and if you lost one of the guys, it was horrible.
Even SAC was like that. Even the B-52 was just 5 or 6 people, but you depended on one another, and you worked as a crew. You worked by crew position. You didn't call people by their first names. When you ran your checklist and stuff like that, you talked to the pilot, the co-pilot, the radar, so on and so on. You didn't say Fred or Jim or Joe or whatnot. It was very professional. And that was a big part of Strategic Air Command. It was very, very professional, and it worked that way.
As we wrap up here, let's talk about some of the planes. I know that it amazes a lot of people that you're able to keep more than 50 planes outside, unlike a lot of air museums, in what looks like tip-top shape. You must have some volunteers who love those planes, and I would think a lot of them, like you, used to work with the Air Force Base.
We have Castle Air Museum. We've got 55 airplanes on display right now, and they're all outdoors. We don't have a building to put them in.
Because when I lived in the area, you hadn't hit 50 yet.
No, we've got 55 right now. We've got 3 in the hangar they're working on. We basically have a volunteer crew chief assigned to each airplane, although I think we've got 2 or 3 we don't have a crew chief assigned right now. But we basically have a crew chief assigned volunteer-wise to each airplane. And they're responsible to kind of keep the airplane clean, minor maintenance type stuff, and whatnot. Then we have a restoration crew, and they're responsible for any new airplanes. They're responsible for getting in shape and fixing up to eventually display, and they're also responsible for any major maintenance type work. And then we have people like the B-52 exam. We have a crew chief, very dedicated individual. And then we have 2 or 3 people like myself. There's a pilot. His name is Al Osborne, and he's a pilot. And he and I spent a lot of time on our B-52 here, just working on it, minor maintenance with the help of an individual that knows the B-52 inside and out. We just did a major repair job on the hatch. We were having problems with the hatch, which is the way we get in and out of the airplane. And it wasn't working properly. It was actually falling off when you opened it. And we had an individual that knew all about it, found the parts that we needed, and it took us 8 hours, but we repaired it and fixed it.
What percentage of the planes are basically shells? Are most of the planes really not airworthy, but still have a lot of the guts in them?
Even though some of them actually flew in, the worst thing you can do is let an airplane just sit on the ground. You've got to fly. So none of them are really airworthy anymore. But I don't think we have any that are just shells. They're all pretty well up to date. For example, our B-52 is probably one of the best B-52s on display anywhere interior-wise. There's a couple like the Air Force Museum that looks better on the outside. But interior-wise, we have just about all the knobs and dials and everything except for some classified equipment that's been removed.
Sure. Can visitors go in any of these planes?
Twice a year we'll have what we call Open Cockpit Day. That's a big fundraiser for us, and we'll open up 20 or 25 airplanes People can either go inside the airplane, or the fighters will have a ladder and then go up and look inside the cockpit. And that's the people just love that.
I would think it would be far too dangerous to have them open, not only for wear and tear, but also injuries.
Well, we have to, for example...
To do it all year round.
Yeah, it is. On occasion, people will come out, and if someone wants a special airplane open for a special purpose, we charge them for that, and we'll have someone come out and open it up and watch them. We just had, I just did it for a lady not long ago. It's kind of interesting. She was a young lady years ago in 1956. She lost her husband in a B-52 crash, and she never really knew much about it. She didn't know much about the airplane or what happened, and he was a crew chief, and he was an extra man on the airplane. Anyway, she wanted to know about the B-52, and she paid some money and came out, and I opened up the airplane, and I spent about 2 hours with her, told her all about the B-52, and took her inside and showed her around. I showed her where, not that I knew a lot about the accident, but I showed her where her husband would have been sitting. And the only people that got out of the airplane was the pilot and co-pilot. They were in the ejection seats, and the airplane apparently caught on fire and blew up, so that people didn't have a time to get out. The two pilots did. But I showed her where he would have been sitting and how undoubtedly he did not have time to get out. But if he had had time, he would have had to gone downstairs. The navigator and a radar would have ejected if they'd had time, and he would have bailed out manually out of one of their open hatches. And I explained that all to her. And actually, when it was all over, she really felt, I don't know what the correct word is, but she really felt...
Maybe closer to her husband?
She was really pleased.
She understood
She really felt kind of pleased and understood what had happened, and she never knew for years. And she really did feel pleased about that. And,
that's sweet.
Yeah, it was. It was really...
Must have felt good.
I felt good about it.
And to her, yes.
Someone told me after she really was pleased about it. It just gave her some closing, I guess is the word.
Fred, what is the reaction in two areas? First of all, I would assume that a lot of young children have never been around or underneath anything that big that's mechanical.
They're amazed. Any of the airplanes, but like open cockpit day, when they come inside the B-52, invariably the first words out of their mouth is, "There's no room inside." They just can't believe how little room there is inside this huge airplane. And then the other day I had a tour with young school kids, and the crew chief was working on one of the airplanes, the C-46, which is a big cargo airplane. There's a lot of room inside. But he let all the kids come up inside. They were just thrilled to death to go up inside that airplane and go up and look at the cockpit and stuff like that. So it is interesting, and they really do enjoy it.
Fred, over the years, there's so many people from around the world who come here. I would think that there have been some who have been on the other side of the action or the other side of the story who come here and see this. What has that been like?
Well, I did have a tour not long ago where there was some South Vietnamese, so they were on our side, but they were really interested in the B-52, for example, but they were also interested in a few of the other airplanes that were involved, the C-123, for example, which is one of the cargo airplanes. They were very interested in seeing the airplanes that they knew were involved in the Vietnam War. And it was interesting talking with them. They understood it. And then the other day, I had a guy, it wasn't a tour, but he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, a rescue helicopter pilot. So he had all kinds of stories.
Oh, I bet.
But he was telling me about the effects of the B-52 bomb drop, because we could drop so many bombs out of one airplane. And he said he could tell stories about these GIs that were going in under fire, and they could hide in these craters from B-52 bomb drops. They could actually get in these craters and would kind of hide from the enemy for a while to protect themselves.
Wow.
You know, it's just, you hear some of these stories, it's just very, very interesting. And the people all over the world, I'd met a couple here the other day, and they just raved about this museum. I was doing a tour with a group, and I saw this couple, and they said, "Oh, I love this museum. It is such a wonderful museum." They love seeing these airplanes where they can walk around the airplanes.
I think, too, even though it's harder on the aircraft to maintain them outside, they were outside things. I mean, this is where they operated. They didn't operate inside a building. They had sunshine on them and bad weather.
They do enjoy it.
Fred, I want to talk about, before we wrap up here, two specific planes. One is the Blackbird.
Okay.
And that was a very early mega supersonic, multi-supersonic plane that's almost all fuel tank.
Yeah.
It's an odd-looking bird, isn't it? It's right out. It's the first thing you see when you drive in.
A lot of people will come in and look at it and then drive off. They won't come into the museum. They just look at that. That's an amazing airplane. That SR-71 that we have sitting in our museum flew more combat missions than any other SR-71. And by combat, I mean it didn't have guns or bombs. It took pictures, reconnaissance pictures. So it flew more combat missions than any other SR-71s. That airplane took the first reconnaissance pictures when we got involved in Vietnam. And it took the first IBDA, Initial Bomb Damage Assessment, after we first bombed Libya years ago.
Wow.
So that airplane's got three distinctive
What a
things
heritage.
Yeah.
The other one is the DC-3, which was the Goonie Bird, the C-47. I know I have delivered a speech here now and then on the history of aviation. The importance of that plane. It made passenger airline service profitable for the first time. But those things, Donald Douglas and built it, and Arthur Raymond was the designer in the 30s.
Yeah.
They're still flying cargo in Alaska now.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I saw a thing on TV with, I think, Buffalo Airlines or something, but they were flying C-47s.
And you can buy one at Bassler Aviation in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And they're retrofitting them now with turboprops on them.
And then a lot of your third world countries, that's their airliner.
Yeah.
I think. The DC-3.
Of all the planes out there, other than the B-52 and the tanker, what's your favorite?
I don't know.
There's some odd-looking plane. Yeah. There's one guppy-looking plane out there, a little short, stubby thing. I forget which one it is. It's cute. Doesn't look as if it could fly.
I don't know which other one would be my favorite. Our B-47, the last flight of any B-47 in the world, is the one that flew in here.
Wow.
And they built, 2,200 of them.
Fred, what does it feel like to have been a part of this? And a lot of times you'll go to a museum and the person showing you around is good at what they're doing, but they weren't part of it. Yeah. You were part of this. You're showing a whole new generation. What does it feel like to be able to do that?
I feel good about it, and I'm proud of it. I'm kind of proud of my career. I'm proud of what we did. And it's good when we do Open Cockpit Day, it's just, you can't believe the number of people that shake your hand and say thank you for your service, which always feels good. They enjoy seeing the airplanes, and they enjoy talking to us, and they enjoy it. It's just a good feeling.
Fred Pillsbury, this has been great fun. I invite anyone who gets to Central California to come to the Castle Air Museum and ask for Fred.
Yeah, that's all right. I enjoyed the tours.
Thanks, Fred.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.